And I call the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this legislation, to me, raises a number of questions around the priorities of this government. When I think about the priorities of government that has just been returned to office, at a time when Australians are feeling the most incredible degree of financial stress, where households are struggling to pay their mortgages and their bills, or even be able to pay their electricity bills or pay for goods at the supermarket and to pay for a simple basket of food. I would hope that the priority of the Australian government would be how they can ease the cost of burden of pressure and alleviate whatever pressure there may be on households at this difficult time. I would hope that in an environment of global instability that we have a government that is focused on reassuring and strengthening our nation so that it can lean into the challenges of the 21st century. When I think about what artificial intelligence could do to our employment market and to jobs creation and growth, I would hope that the focus of the government was on skills and economic developments to reassure Australians that we have a way forward to be able to meet the future with confidence. I would hope that at a time like this, we had leadership that was focused on building the strength of our nation. And more importantly, when we have a government that has been given a gift by the Australian people of a majority of 94 seats, that it would be focused on steering the good ship Australia towards a brighter future. But at the moment, we have a very different type of government embodied by this legislation, gifted with the enormous privilege it has been by the Australian people. Its priorities at the moment are how it strips accountability and scrutiny of its decision-making. Now, I think the term we should use for that, Deputy Speaker, is not just how they are stripping accountability of their decision-making, but how they are shutting a curtain of censorship over the departments, the decision-making of government to impose a culture of secrecy on Canberra. I can say with one thing, Deputy Speaker, nobody walked into the ballot box at the general election this year and voted for that. Nobody walked into the ballot box and said, I'm going to go and vote for a re-elected Albanese government because they are going to be the most secretive government in Australian political history. Nobody walked into the ballot box and said, I'm going to vote for the Albanese government because they are going to impose a veil of secrecy. Nobody walked into the ballot box, no Australian, and said because they're going to increase the costs and diminish access to information. Nobody walked into the ballot box and said we are going to vote for the Albanese government because they are going to redact more information available to the Australian people. Nobody walked into the ballot box because they said I'm going to vote for the Albanese government because they are going to limit my capacity to be able to scrutinise government decision-making. Nobody walked into the ballot box and said I am going to vote for the Albanese government because they're going to reduce the number of staff to the members of the opposition so that they can be less accountable in this parliament. And I am sure as this day follows night, nobody walked into the ballot box, Deputy Speaker, and voted for the Albanese government and said, I am going to vote for the Albanese government so they can strip a pathway for review of decision-making around honouring our deceased war veterans. And when it comes down to the priorities of this government, to make this one of its first premier pieces of legislation, it says something brutal and frankly quite terrifying about their priorities as a government. Because while we have former state Labor premiers marching down the red carpets in Beijing right now and celebrating past military conflicts, we seem completely unwilling to fully honour and have pathways for review of honouring the legacy of our own. There is something deeply worrying about the priorities of the Albanese government, because the Coalition proudly supports all men and women who have served in uniform, and in some cases, tragically, have had to make the ultimate sacrifice in defence of our nation. And we ultimately believe that anybody who has been prepared to make a sacrifice to stand up and fight for our country should have their courage, their bravery acknowledged, respected through not just the history and the stories of our nation, but through medals, as is appropriate for their valiant service. And the tribunal exists to make sure that there's proper and fair review of the decisions of the Defence Department to make sure that there is proper recognition. Because in the tragedy, in the fog of war, of course, decisions are sometimes made based on information that is incorrect. We simply believe that information should be able to come to light so decision-making is fair and fully respects what actually happened on the ground. And we know sometimes, through court cases, through other information provided, that what first appears can in fact be wrong. That's why we have reviews. That's why we have a pathway to make sure that new information can be provided. But this government wants to shut that process down. And I simply cannot fathom how this is its priority right now in comparison to the enormity of other problems not just the Australian people face, but frankly the bigger problems the Australian Defence Forces face around their capacity and their position to meet the challenges of the 21st century, which, according to the Australian government's own white paper, says is the most strategic operating environment since the Second World War. The establishment of the Defence Honours and Awards Appeals Tribunal in 2011 provides a statutory agency for an independent review of the past actions and decisions. Now, we know that military officers are not infallible and errors of judgment can be made in relation to recommendations for medallic recognition. And by simply interfering in this process, we are removing a pathway for revision of the merits of past decisions. And it's a simple expectation that there be transparency and that if new information comes to light, that those decisions can be reviewed, because we know in the past they have been, and correctly so. The government is seeking a remedy but has given no justification or evidence of why this is the case or the basis for doing so beyond the department doesn't want to go through the laborious task of wanting to honour our former defence personnel and giving them full recognition. And frankly, I understand it's bureaucratically problematic for the department, but when we're talking about the legacy and honouring those who are prepared to sacrifice for our nation, I think you can put up with it at your desks. There is a simple expectation from all Australians, I would hope, to properly honour our servicemen and women, and that is what we expect on the opposition benches, but clearly they have found a compliant government that is prepared to trade off that full recognition in the process, because they are going to introduce a 20-year limit for the tribunal to review decisions in the past, and it should justifiably be opposed. In discussing the impact of several of the Defence's proposals, the tribunal said it would render invalid 95% of applications decided by the tribunal between 2020 and 2023, and if implemented would abolish and curtail current and significant rights of ADF members, veterans and families and others to seek external independent merits of defence decisions, refusing to recommend an ADF member or veteran for a defence honour or award. How this can be the priority of this government at this time, I simply cannot understand. They have made their decision and they are introducing this bill to this parliament. It is, of course, going through the House of Representatives right now, but it will, of course, go through its proper reviews in the Senate. The question in the end is how can members of this government come into this parliament and stand by this legislation? I see the minister at the desk. We, of course, don't see many of the members of the government standing up and supporting this legislation by speaking in favour of it. To be fair, I can understand why. I wouldn't want to be attached to it either if I was on the other side of this chamber. I think they would be held with a point of mocking and ridicule amongst their RSLs and many of their defence personnel for standing up and saying this is my priority in the federal parliament right now. While I was sent to Canberra by the community because people had genuine concerns about their future and wanting security and confidence about their capacity to be able to live out their best lives. If your priority, and you're associated with the priority of seeking to diminish the full recognition of defence personnel, I suspect most people in their electorates will turn around and say, you have very strange priorities indeed. So, my pathway forward, Deputy Speaker, even though I've no doubt this will pass through the House of Representatives with the support of those on the other side of this chamber and their gargantuan majority and their distorted priorities, is to, of course, write to all of the local RSLs in the Goldstein electorate, including to their presidents, Thomas Kinnaid from Hampton RSL, James Steedman from Caulfield RSL, Geordie Burgess from Hyatt RSL, Simon Richards from Cheltenham Moorabbin RSL and Bentley RSL, and of course to Mark Scrofell, who is now the State President of the Victorian RSL, and of course seek their input and opinion and encourage them to write submissions to the review, any inquiry that comes out of the Senate process to make sure that their views are heard. And of course I encourage any member of our veterans community and of course the entire Australian community to write to the Senate inquiry and have their views heard and ask whether they think it's appropriate that the government is engaging in a pathway to limit the review of decision-making of defence personnel and the full recognition of their past service. I doubt there are going to be many Australians who turn around and say the best thing for those wearing our uniform is to diminish or delete the pathways for full recognition of their service. Maybe there are, but I doubt it. That just seems to be the priorities of the Albanese government. I suspect most Australians would, one, believe that it was better there was full recognition and, if necessary, a pathway of review, and in addition to that, to say to the government, don't you have slightly better priorities than this? The answer is clearly no. But in addition to that, I would encourage every member of the Australian community to look at this legislation and reflect not just about it in its isolation, about what it says about the Albanese government in the context of the ADF, but to look at it in terms of the priorities of the Albanese government in the context of their broader legislative government agenda. To look at the fact that they're shutting down the pathways for Australians to review the decisions of full recognition of our ADF personnel, then look at what they're doing around shutting down transparency of decision-making in Australian government decisions, around redacting documents and trying to keep secret information about government decision-making, around imposing a new truth tax to limit access to information to the Australian people, around denying staff to members of parliament to diminish the capacity for scrutiny of government, the extent to which you have ministers and the Prime Minister who come into this chamber increasingly and simply won't answer questions or say, I refer to my previous answer, which included not answering questions, where we increasingly see decision-making made by members of this government which is only to the benefit of cartellish behaviour towards the benefit of those who donate to the Labor Party or to boost the benefits and the graft of the Labor Party. And you realise that the priorities of this government is not the Australian people. It is not to respect the Australian people. And it is not to recognise how we use this parliament to advance the Australian people, but it is simply to achieve its own ends. And I say that with absolute sadness, because if anything, we come into this parliament hopefully with an esprit de corps that the objective of being elected to the federal parliament is to advance Australia and to ultimately advance Australia fair for all. But when you see pieces of legislation like this, and of course the one that is being flagged by the Attorney-General to shut down scrutiny of government, and the behaviour of the government in the context of question time, and the decisions of the Prime Minister, we're now seeing a pattern of behaviour which says that the 94 seats that this government has got in the House of Representatives suggests that a hubris and an arrogance is now distorting not just their behaviour but their priorities, and it's unfortunately focused on themselves rather than the Australian people. And we need to call it out, because the consequences and the onflow to the Australian people will be significant. Now is the time for good people to stand up and call it out. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.